Today we are going to the early 20th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Linda Burfield Hazzard was born on December the 18th, 1867 in Carver County, Minnesota. She was one of 8 children born to her parents, Montgomery and Susanna Burfield. She was an intelligent and studious child, but was known to be somewhat overbearing. In 1885, when Linda was 18 years old, she married a man named Edwin Perry and later had 2 children. But the marriage didn't last. The couple divorced and Linda moved to Minneapolis. She was fascinated by the healing power of nature and believed that excessive eating was a cause of most illnesses, and that fasting would remove toxins from the body, correct imbalances, and allow the body to heal itself. She was inspired by books written by the American physician who was a pioneer in therapeutic fasting, named Edward H. Dewey, and in spite of the fact that she had no formal medical qualifications, Linda managed to set herself up as a practitioner of alternative medicine. In 1902, a patient in her care died, and the coroner determined that the death was caused by starvation. Linda was investigated, and it soon came to the attention of the police that some jewellery that had belonged to the deceased was missing. Relatives speculated that Linda had stolen it. The police interviewed her and reviewed the strange death of the patient, but it was eventually determined that she could not be prosecuted. There was little evidence that she had taken the jewellery, and as she was not licensed to practice medicine, she could not be prosecuted for malpractice. Soon after, Linda met a man named Samuel Christman Hazzard. He had studied at the military academy at West Point, but did not graduate. To Linda, he seemed charming, but he was a heavy drinker and already had 2 failed marriages behind him. Despite this, Linda and Samuel got married. Soon after, however, the authorities prosecuted him for bigamy, as he had failed to divorce one of his previous brides. And in 1904, Samuel Hazzard was sent to prison for 2 years. When he was released in 1906, the couple decided to leave Minneapolis. Both had become well known in the city for the wrong reasons, so they packed their bags and travelled to the state of Washington. Here they lived in the small rural community of Olalla in Kitsap County. They set up home on a small holding, and Linda's plan was to earn enough money so she could build a sanitarium where she could treat her patients. She named the new property Wilderness Heights. In the meantime, however, she needed to work, so set up a practice in Seattle. She travelled daily from her new home to the city. Washington State seemed the perfect place for her, as due to a loophole regarding people who worked in alternative medicine, she was able to obtain a license to practice, even though she did not have any form of medical qualification. Despite the harsh methods she used, many people seemed to embrace her theories and treatments, and the practice attracted many patients. In January 1908, a Norwegian lady named Daisy Maud Hagland came to the practice. Linda recommended that she fast for 50 days. She was in her late 30s, but in February, before she finished fasting, she died. The same year, another lady died, named Ida Wilcox. Linda, however, carried on practicing her alternative medicines and published a book named Fasting for the Cure of Disease. 2 more patients died in 1909, and more followed in 1910. However, when an engineer named Earl Edward Ehrman died in her care, her practice started to receive more attention, and the Seattle Daily Times headlined their front page with the words, "Woman MD kills another patient." Despite this, there were many patients who wanted to improve their health with her treatments and take advantage of her medical theories. Many, however, didn't improve, and in the space of a few months, 2 more men died under her care. A man named Ivan Flux found his way to Linda's practice. He was originally from England and had come to Washington to buy a ranch. Fascinated with her treatments, He placed himself under her care. Mrs. Hazzard insisted that he fasted to cure his ailments. As his fast continued and he grew weaker, she managed to gain control of his finances, and after 53 days, he died. When his family was informed of his passing, he had less than $100 to his name. Still, however, authorities took no action to stop her practice. Locals dubbed her Wilderness Heights property Starvation Heights, and people started to question her methods. Later that year, health inspectors tried to convince a man named Lewis Ellsworth Rader to abandon his fast when he was being treated at a Seattle hotel. He was a former Washington state legislator and publisher of the magazine Sound Views. But he refused to cease his treatments, and Linda transferred him to Wilderness Heights, where he later died. All of her patients, however, were not being forced to fast. They were doing it of their own free will, so despite the authorities' concerns, no action was taken. Two sisters named Dorothea and Claire Williamson were staying at the Empress Hotel in Victoria, British Columbia, when one day, when reading a newspaper, they chanced upon an advertisement for Linda's book. The sisters were from England and very wealthy, but they were always convinced that they were suffering from one ailment or another and had great interest in alternative medicine. They ordered the book and some literature on the natural therapeutic treatments available at Wilderness Heights. In February 1911, they travelled to Seattle to meet Mrs. Linda Hazzard. They were both excited about the opportunity to improve their health, but unfortunately their dreams of an idyllic country retreat did not materialise, as they were informed that the sanitarium hadn't quite been completed, and instead they met Linda at her office in the Northern Bank and Trust building. She placed them in an apartment on Seattle's Capitol Hill and presented them with a treatment plan. This mainly consisted of being fed vegetable soup twice a day and having long sessions with enemas in a bathtub. The bathtub was covered with canvas supports in case one of the sisters fainted during their treatment. After 2 months, they were transferred to Linda's home in Olalla, but by this time they were weak and delirious. Just before they left the apartment, however, Linda's lawyer arrived with the newly drawn-up will of Claire and Dorothea Williamson. The will left clear instructions that Linda Hazzard should receive an annual cash allowance from the sisters' estate, and that she should also be in charge of their funeral arrangements should they pass away before her. Strangely, however, at the end of April, the sisters' childhood nanny, Margaret Conway, received a mysterious telegram asking her to urgently go to Olalla, where the sisters were in desperate need of her assistance. At the time, Miss Conway was in Australia, but believing the telegram was from Dorothea and always loyal to the sisters, she boarded a ship bound for North America. The boat arrived in Vancouver, and Miss Conway made her way to Seattle, where she was met by Linda's husband, Samuel. He looked mournful, and after he introduced himself and took her suitcase, he explained that Claire Williamson had died and Dorothea was insane. He then escorted her to the mortuary, where she was shown the body of the deceased. Miss Conway, however, did not recognise the person she was being shown. She knew Claire as a healthy, vibrant person, but the body was of a skeletal-like woman who had died of starvation. After leaving the mortuary, she was taken to Olalla to see Dorothea. Miss Conway was immediately alarmed. Dorothea's bones protruded so sharply that she couldn't sit down without feeling pain. She was also living in a one-roomed outbuilding, which resembled a garden shed. Dorothea asked Miss Conway to take her away from the place, but when Linda was present, she always said that she enjoyed being there and that Mrs. Hazzard was a caring person who was curing her ailments. Miss Conway could not believe the situation she was witnessing. It was truly horrifying. Things, however, became even more concerning when Linda Hazzard invited her into the office, and when Miss Conway informed her of her intention to take Dorothea away from Wilderness Heights, Linda explained that it would not be possible, as the sisters had made her and her husband Samuel the executors of their estates and Dorothea's lifetime guardian. She added that they also had power of attorney to make decisions on Dorothea's behalf. Linda had already taken possession of the sisters' jewellery and clothes, and when she took Miss Conway's report on Dorothea's mental state, she arrived wearing one of the late Claire Williamson's dresses. Miss Conway felt intimidated by Mrs. Hazzard. Her overpowering voice and strict, rigid demeanour made her feel very uneasy in her presence. She knew that she had to get Dorothea removed from her care, but was unable to do it alone, so she sent a message to Dorothea's uncle, named John Herbert, who was living in Portland. He quickly came to Olalla to demand that Mrs. Hazzard release his niece from her care, but Mrs. Hazzard calmly insisted that he pay $2,000 in unpaid treatments before she would agree with his request. After some negotiation, the sum of $1,000 was paid, and Dorothea left with Miss Conway and Mr. Herbert. John Herbert could not believe how the practice was allowed to operate when it treated patients so awfully, so went to the British Vice Consul in Tacoma. The Vice Consul was shocked by the very sad and tragic story being told by Mr. Herbert and Miss Conway, and immediately contacted the Kitsap County authorities, demanding that she be prosecuted for causing the death of a British national under her care. Kitsap County, however, did not want to pursue the matter. They knew it would be costly and didn't have funds available to pay for the legal case. As pressure grew from the British Vice Consul, it was agreed that Dorothea Williamson would fund the prosecution, and in August 1911, Linda Hazzard was arrested. The trial opened in January 1912 at the county courthouse in Port Orange. Linda's defence team told the press that the medical establishments were conspiring against her as she was able to cure patients they were unable to help. They also maintained that the patients that came to her were already ill, so those that died would have died anyway, even if they had sought more conventional medical practices. The prosecution, however, produced witnesses who were medical experts and who discredited her practices. They also had large amounts of evidence that proved that Linda benefited from the death of her patients, including forged signatures on legal documents. They eloquently told the court that this amounted to financial starvation. Her defence team included her employees, who told the court how so many patients had greatly benefited from her treatments, and that many often came back for more remedies. John Ivor Hugland, whose wife Daisy had died while being treated by Mrs. Hazzard, also testified that he had faith in her methods and did not feel she was responsible for his wife's death. Linda also refused to take any responsibility for Claire Williamson's death and considered the trial an attack on her as a successful woman and an attack on natural medical treatments. When the trial ended, the jury went out to deliberate, but shortly afterwards they returned to find the defendant, Linda Hazzard, guilty of manslaughter, and the judge sentenced her to between 2 and 20 years hard labour at the penitentiary in Walla Walla. She also had her medical licence revoked. Less than 3 years later, on the 26th of December 1915, she was released, and a year afterwards, the governor, Ernest Lister, gave her a full pardon. Along with her husband Samuel, Linda moved to New Zealand. Here she worked, calling herself a physician, dietitian, and osteopath. She also had time to write another book. She made quite a lot of money in New Zealand, and in 1920 she returned to Olalla, where she eventually completed her sanitarium. As she no longer possessed a medical licence, she called it a school of health. The sanitarium proved to be a success, but in 1935 it burnt down. 3 years later, Linda, now in her late 60s, became ill. In an attempt to get well, she undertook a fast of her own. However, it proved to be unsuccessful, and on June the 24th, 1938, Linda Burfield Hazzard died at the age of 70. The number of patients who died due to Mrs. Hazzard's fasting diet is unknown, but estimates range from between 20 to 40 people. Dorothea Williamson recovered her health and returned to England, where she married the Reverend Wyndham Allen Chaplin on the 7th of May, 1914. Tragically, just 3 months later, her husband drowned. She never married again and died on the 2nd of January 1945, aged 72. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case